And if we focus on mammals, like us, we're mammals, 60% of all land mammals on Earth now are livestock, mostly cattle and pigs, 36% are humans, and just 4% are wild mammals. So that's represented by the lonely rhino in that circle there. That means that 4% of life on Earth now are the bears, whales, wolverines, deer, beavers, elephants, jaguars. And the first main reason for this is habitat loss. So we're displacing wild animals and other life forms globally by turning natural habitats into roads, farms, urban areas, mines, cut blocks. So we know that global biodiversity loss is much higher than background rates. So there's always been extinction in the past, but it's orders of magnitude higher than those background rates now. And it's been driven mainly by deforestation and forest degradation, which means roads and logging. Where is the future naturally regenerated old growth going to come from? The answer is nowhere. The future of a regime that annihilates both old growth forest and younger natural forest is a future of entirely human-made forests, which are inferior to natural forests for wildlife for a really long time, like centuries. This is a BC government press release from this spring where a spokesperson from the Council of Forest Industries, which represents all the major licensees in BC, said that logging forests after wildfire somehow helps restore areas for wildlife. This is total garbage.
We are honored to have Darlene McIntosh here today, a Lheidli elder and the 8th Chancellor of UNBC, to welcome us.
Hadi. Hadi.
Hadi.
They're not used to this. So usually when we come to the university, we do the greeting, of course. Dakal, carry your word. Hadi meaning hello. And so I would say it out to you and you would repeat it and say it back to me. So we'll have to get you to practice that, Hadi. So it's my honor and pleasure to be here. We're talking about forestry and how important it is in the north here. And I know Michelle has been really involved with Lheidli with regards to forestry and has been part of kind of indirectly the working group to the ancient forest, Chunto Wadajut, which we are stewards and caretakers of that area. And we were lucky to be able to stop the cutting of the cedars there, and now it's the only inland rainforest in all of Canada, and we are looking after it, and going to do a lot more out there. So I'll get you to stand, please. If you can. So I want you to take a nice deep cleansing breath throughout your whole body. Nice deep cleansing breath. So as we take that breath into our body, we acknowledge ourselves. And how many times do we do that? It's all about self-care, and our life is so busy now. You know, you haven't completed one project and you're on to another one. And it just coincides with our world today, how upside down and broken it is. And when we have leadership coming to talk about forestry, how important is that? You know, as human beings, we think we're in control, but guess who's in control? Mother Earth is in control. And we have an intimate connection with Mother Earth and all that she gives us. With the trees breathe out, we breathe in. We breathe out, the trees breathe in. And that's a very intimate connection with our environment. But do we think about that? Do we think about how we must maintain our clean water and all the things that we need to live a healthy whole life? But those are moments that we think about, not all the time. And we need to honor Mother Earth for all she gives us. She sustains our life here on this earth plane, giving us everything we need. But yet we abuse her by going into the forest and taking the trees down without a second thought because money becomes the most important thing. Well, when our trees are gone, are you going to sustain yourself with eating money? No, you're not. So we need to look after our forest. So we, the Lheidli T'enneh Nation, have been on our traditional lands over 9,000 years as supported by lithic evidence. The changes that have taken place over thousands of years supports the enduring strength, courage, and fortitude of our peoples. Our governance through the Batlats brought balance and harmony with our brothers and sisters of other First Nations people. Lheidli T'enneh's clans are Frog, Lisilu, Grouse, Utsut, Beaver, Sa, and Bear Sus. Through this system, we know who our family connections are. Through our oral history, the use of legend told of our travels, our hunting and fishing territories, our trading practices with all peoples. May you remember and hold steadfast in what Creator's blessed us with, and that is our traditional territories. Our ancestors have always welcomed people to our territories. We are, on behalf of Lheidli T'enneh's elders, our youth, community members, and chief and council, it's absolutely our honor to welcome each and every one of you to our traditional territories. All my relations, Masi, thank you. Please be seated.
Hello, everybody. I'm Michelle, and like Alex said, I did my schooling here. I completed my schooling here 10 years ago, and I worked here for 6 years, but I've never actually done a talk here about Conservation North, so this is very, very special to me. We're a volunteer group that came together in 2017 because we're all really concerned about the loss of nature and wild places in our area. This is our core group. Nothing would happen without the efforts of these guys, Cam, Asta, Jen, Kate, Rob, Allie, and Rebecca here, who's volunteering for us. It's often my face and name that's associated with our group, but actually nothing would really happen without these folks here. So thank you, guys. So I'm going to start with a story. In the early 60s, people started realizing, started kind of becoming more aware of what industrial civilization was doing to Earth and talking about what it might take if we had to leave a dying planet to start a colony on Mars, for example. So in order to live elsewhere, we would need to recreate Earth's life support system in a new place. So fast forward to the early 90s, a wealthy investor from Texas put a lot of money into building a prototype for what they call the total life system that humans could bring to another planet if we needed to. So it was described as an experiment, and the idea is that this sealed world would support its inhabitants without inputs from the outside world. So a big compound was built in the Arizona desert on 3 acres, and they called it Biosphere 2. So they brought in thousands of species of plants and animals, including hummingbirds and honeybees, and even small primates and others. They built a farm and other artificial ecosystems, including a rainforest, a desert, and a marsh. So for about $200 million, they built and ran this sealed ecological world where 8 people spent the next 2 years of their lives. And the experiment started failing fairly quickly after they all moved in. So they started losing oxygen because a bacterium in the soil that was proliferating ate up all the oxygen. All the pollinators died, so no one was there to pollinate their food crops. Carbon dioxide levels were getting too high. The water was taken over by algae, and the land was taken over by cockroaches. So the participants couldn't feed themselves, and they started starving. So this was humanity's strongest attempt to build and maintain an ecosystem, and it failed. It collapsed. The deputy director of this project said, after a few years, what they did learn, the single most important lesson, was just about how little we truly understand the Earth's systems. A journalist followed that with, the Earth's systems are just too complex and interconnected to be able to recreate them completely. So I think the lesson from Biosphere 2 is that there's a lot we don't know about ecosystems themselves, even the ones we try and build. So we're left with Biosphere 1, which is Earth. And And 25 years later, we're losing a lot of wildlife and wild places. So the other life forms that we share this planet with are in decline in a big way. I'm sure that many people here have had their own sense of this if you spent a lot of time in the bush over the last 40 years or longer. According to a global scientific assessment done a few years ago, populations of animals with backbones, so that's mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish, that are being monitored have seen a 69% drop in their numbers or populations since 1970. In 2018, researchers did a comprehensive accounting of the body weight of all life on Earth. This time it was their weight as the biomass of life. It was a global snapshot of the abundances of life forms that we know of. So they looked at all wild animals and plants, as well as humans and our domesticated animals. And if we focus on mammals, like us, we're mammals, 60% of all land mammals on Earth now are livestock, mostly cattle and pigs, 36% are humans, and just 4% are wild mammals. So that's represented by the lonely rhino in that circle there. That means that 4% of life on Earth now are the bears, whales, wolverines, deer, beavers, elephants, jaguars. Updated numbers from 2023 show that the total weight of Earth's wild mammals, from elk, deer mice, lynx, orcas, is now less than 6% of the combined tonnage of women, men, children, and farm animals and pets on Earth. So that's the little green slice that you see off to the left. And the first main reason for this is habitat loss, which is showing as red here. And of course, all of us here know this already pretty much. So we're displacing wild animals and other life forms globally by turning natural habitats into roads, farms, urban areas, mines, cut blocks. None of this is new to you guys, I know that. And what that looks like here is that we're turning places like this, which is in Lheidli, Tenay, and Simcoe territory, into this or worse. So we know that global biodiversity loss is much higher than background rates. So there's always been extinction in the past, but it's orders of magnitude higher than those background rates now. And it's been driven mainly by deforestation and forest degradation, which means roads and logging, logging and road building. So it's associated with the destruction of intact forest landscapes, that is, primary forests for materials. A primary forest is a forest of any age that has never been industrially logged. That's it. We sometimes call them natural forests. We use those terms interchangeably. In BC, all old growth is also primary forest. So all old growth in BC right now is of natural origin. It hasn't regenerated after industrial logging. Much of the forest advocacy in BC has focused on old growth, on protecting old growth forests, which is critically important for maintaining biodiversity in BC. I think the reason for that is because a lot of the forest advocacy has come from the coast, where they just have more older forests. They have really beautiful temperate rainforests. So they tend to think that old growth is the most important thing. But we think, being a group in interior BC, that in fact all primary forests ought to be protected, not just old growth, and I'll explain why. And how we came to realize this involves a slightly embarrassing story about me. So 4 years ago, we were exploring this area 45 minutes east of town, and we saw flagging that indicated that a pellet company was the owner of the license to cut this area. So we tromped around for a few hours to get a sense of the forest, and later that week we made a bit of a public fuss about the fact that part of the inland rainforest was being set aside for pellet logging. I was asked for an interview with the Rocky Mountain Goat newspaper, and in the interview I referred to this area as old growth. The interviewer also spoke with someone that had actually looked at what the government data said about the administrative age of this polygon, and it was not in fact old growth. So I was wrong, and I felt pretty foolish about getting that wrong. But it got us thinking. Industrial forestry has been doing its thing here for decades, targeting old growth forests for the most part. So if we're also taking the natural forests that are not considered old, then we're getting rid of what's old right now, and then we're not only getting rid of what's old right now, we're also getting rid of what's going to be natural old growth one day, like the pellet company license area that we'd walked in. So where is the future naturally regenerated old growth going to come from? The answer is nowhere. The future of a regime that annihilates both old-growth forest and younger natural forest is a future of entirely human-made forests, which are inferior to natural forests for wildlife for a really long time, like centuries. Forest management destroys complexity by reducing the number of tree species, homogenizing the trees to a single cohort, single age cohort, and by ensuring a future where mature trees never get old enough and large enough to die and become wildlife habitat. So plantations like this are designed to appropriate incident solar radiation for the crop, which is the tree. They shade out the light in the understory, they rain down acidic needles, and of course the soils have been crushed by machines a lot of the time. These researchers say that doing this limits the availability of microhabitats and biological legacies, meaning standing and fallen dead trees, to plant and animal communities. What they mean by that is that industrial forests like this lack the niches, the nooks and crannies that wildlife use, like standing dead trees and fallen trees. And of course, that's pretty obvious to everybody here. And we know that this type of ecosystem covers vast areas of the interior. In a primary forest, birds partition themselves vertically. So different species make their homes at different heights above the ground. For example, pileated woodpeckers make their cavities pretty high up in the canopy. Downy woodpeckers might occupy a slightly lower spot, while nuthatches and chickadees tend to be found a bit lower on the tree. This can only really happen in forests capable of providing those homes at each of those heights. Most of this is happening in dead trees, and there have to be enough dead trees for every hectare of forest for each of these unique homes to be built and maintained. Plantations of any age lack this. When we convert a natural forest into a plantation, this is what we lose. And when we convert enough of the landscape, these are the species that disappear. Primary forests have higher biodiversity than human-modified forests. So leaning trees in a primary forest is how weasels get through deep winter snow to hunt voles and mice. Irregular gaps in the overstory create dappled light that certain ferns require to thrive. Large fallen logs are homes for hundreds of small mammals and insects. Deep earthy soils with decaying wood keep salamanders cool and moist. And all these things are lost when old trees destined to lean over and die fall to the ground and decay, when those trees are taken away to the mill. So when you look at the government inventory data, what that data says about the age of any given forest, what it shows is the age of the dominant trees, the oldest living trees. That's it. So a younger natural forest, like this one, that shows up in the provincial government inventory as being 100 years old, say there was a natural event that killed most of the trees 100 years ago, will contain standing dead trees, hollows, rotting logs, all of which are 2 to 3 times the age of those dominant living trees. It takes several generations of the oldest trees dying to create a load of fallen, rotting logs on the forest floor, like what's in the photo here. So this log represents unbroken natural forest development over maybe 500 years and is a very important habitat feature because it's used by voles and mice, which are the base of the food chain, and probably a few long-toed salamanders, and of course many, many invertebrates, bugs. So a natural forest like this one that is on paper 100 years old looks quite different from what a plantation will look like when it reaches 100 years. If we only look at the BC government forest inventory and see that a plantation is now 100, we assume that it looks like a natural forest of the same age, like this one, but that's not the case because it's just the dominant trees in that plantation that are 100. It will take several more generations of tree death and decay in that plantation over time to get the important structures wildlife need back, the standing dead trees and the fallen rotting logs in particular. Wildlife in this region don't have this time. I don't have a photo of a 100-year-old plantation. We have to imagine them because the oldest ones we have here are around 50 to 60. If you're talking about a forest regenerating after logging, it's not simply a matter of waiting 100 years for the trees to grow. You need to wait long enough for enough of them to rot and fall over before it will look and function like a proper forest again. So we're underestimating by a factor of 2 to 3 times the time it takes back to get the attributes back a primary forests have, like rotting logs, which of course get crushed by machines when you log or they get put into a slash pile. So a 100-year-old natural forest could be considered therefore 2 to 3 times that old from the perspective of wildlife. Natural forests are a lot like a pot of boiling water. So if we imagine that this pot represents primary or never logged forests, and the bubbles represent old age classes or old growth, at any one time, 30 or 50 or 70% could be bubbles, depending on the forest type where you are. So it would be different if you were in Treaty 8 lands in the Northeast, or in the Okanagan, or here in subboreal spruce forests, or in the Great Bear Rainforest. So every ecosystem will have a different proportion of bubbles, and natural forests are always changing. Some of these forests will be old, some will be mature forests on the cusp of getting old, some will have had a recent fire where seedlings are shoulder to shoulder with newly created dead wildlife trees. So my point here is that the bubbles of old growth require that the entire pot of primary forest be left to its own designs. Any type of rotational forestry destroys this process in its tracks. I want to talk about the importance of natural disturbances and forestry's typical response to them. So when a natural forest, like a fire or a beetle outbreak, is severe, i.e. it kills most of the dominant trees, BC's Forest Inventory Database will record that forest as being young again because the administrative age of that forest is based on those dominant trees. So it's no longer technically old growth. The age on paper of that forest gets administratively reset after a fire or an insect outbreak goes through, in other words. Does this mean that the forest is no longer has ecological value? Of course not. Our breathtaking interior spruce forests, for example, evolved with the spruce beetle that you see pictured here. When they get hit by a severe outbreak, it hits the oldest and biggest trees, the overstory trees die, and then the trees that have been waiting just under the canopy grow quickly in response to getting light. So these are self-perpetuating systems. These old forests have multiple layers of trees of different ages and sizes, and extensive root systems and mycorrhizal networks. This is another picture of our beautiful subboreal spruce forests that have been affected by beetle, because they're always there. Diana 6 studies trees that survive bark beetle outbreaks and has suggested that those survivor trees pass on genetic resistance to beetles to their offspring. She refers to beetle outbreaks as natural selection events, meaning that they're beneficial to forest resilience over the long term for the simple reason that survivors are genetically unique and their offspring are destined to become more common with time. So I think everyone here has probably heard the argument that we should log to prevent beetle spread, but that is false because you cannot log your way out of a beetle outbreak. There's no way to reduce high beetle populations by logging, and this is something that Diana 6 has to mention all the time. She says these forests have been through outbreaks for millennia, and they've somehow recovered for millennia from those outbreaks as well. The idea that you have to log forests that have had a natural disturbance like beetle is so pervasive that it's even on cans of some of our excellent local beer. So this beer is great, but the label needs improvement. Basically, it says that the Bowen Valley, which is a place that was affected by spruce beetle in the early 80s, needed to be clear cut because of the spruce beetle. No, the forest would have recovered better if they had been left alone. That was an economic decision, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the Bowen clear cut did not need to happen for the spruce beetle. So as we confront ecological and economic problems at the same time across the province, a solution is often presented to us, which is to simply log the last primary forests better. What is being promoted right now by people involved in forestry and even by some environmental groups, which is surprising, is better logging in a lot of the remaining primary forests in BC. We don't agree. Better logging just degrades forests differently, and one of the ways it does this is through high road densities. So this is the Mount Tom area in the Quesnel Highlands. This area is used for research trials and alternative logging in high elevation spruce and subalpine forests to see what the effects might be on mountain caribou and other species. And I believe these trials started about 20 years ago, or maybe a little earlier than that. So this involved doing partial cutting instead of clear cutting. But one of the things that stands out when you look at the satellite image is the proliferation of roads. You can pull this up on Google Earth to measure road density with a little ruler tool that Google Earth has. And what you will get here is that the road density for this area is 3.97 linear kilometers per kilometer squared. This is important because we know that road densities that are higher than 0.6 are really harmful to large-bodied animals like grizzly bears and moose. 0.6 is kind of a magic number for that road density thing. So when you get higher road densities that are higher than that number, you get wildlife loss, avoidance, and decline. Road densities are already an issue in many places, and logging differently does not help with this. Okay, so now for the buzzwords and BS part of this talk. So there's a fire ecologist named Evan Frost who's based in Oregon, and he posts a lot about forest management in the US, and I'm always struck by the parallels between messaging from government, industry, and even academia in the Western US and what happens here. He says, this is from his tweet, anytime you see a land management agency use the code words forest health, resilience, and fuels reduction in the same sentence, you can translate this as meaning we're planning a commercial timber sale. So the language of crisis and catastrophe and opportunity is often used when natural disturbances happen in primary forests that people want to log. And it's often paired with the we will swoop in and save nature from itself narrative. This is a BC government press release from this spring where a spokesperson from the Council of Forest Industries, which represents all the major licensees in BC, said that logging forests after wildfire somehow helps restore areas for wildlife. This is total garbage, and if you don't believe me, watch the recording of a webinar we hosted a few years ago on post-disturbance logging in natural forests by 3 respected forest scientists and a traditional knowledge holder. Last year, the BC government canceled land designations designed to protect wildlife habitat in the Skeena region. The minister said that this was part of a plan for better forest management, and the BC government spokesperson said that they were opening up these areas to logging to, quote, address beetle kill and promote ecological resilience. The published science on this is so clear that we know that that also is garbage. Logging natural forests reduces ecological resilience. This one might be my favorite. It basically says, the spruce beetle destroyed the forest, so we had to log it in order to prepare the land for reforestation. Again, we know that spruce beetle forests recover on their own. They reforest themselves. That was an excuse to log. The beetle is the Trojan horse most of the time. Let's be honest that these are economic decisions, not ecological ones. The messaging, though, is relentless. And once you notice it, you see it coming from all corners of the industrial forestry machine. So we see primary forests being referred to with these terms in order to diminish their value and reduce public resistance to logging them. So they're characterized, this is a forest on the Goat River area. It was affected by a defoliation about 30 years ago, Western hemlock looper, which is a normal part of this ecosystem. Government, industry, even some academics refer to forests like this as waste, residuals, unhealthy, low value, low quality, damaged, disease, fire prone. These are terms that are often used to sort of reduce how the public sees a forest in order to increase social license for destroying them. To bring all this back to biodiversity, every old forest you've ever set foot in has had many natural disturbances, and all old growth forests in BC owe their structure and complexity, habitat, to the natural workings of insects, disease, and fire. These guys say that diversity in plants and animals is related to having diversity of natural forest ages and structures, and those things emerge from the accumulation of natural disturbances of various kinds, intensities, and sizes on the landscape. So in other words, if we want biodiversity, we have to protect nature's processes. To have proper old growth forest, you need to protect the system that creates it. Pre-contact landscapes, pre-contact forests were a mosaic, with some having lots of old, some having higher proportions of naturally young forests, say right after a severe fire. Wildlife and other life forms, plants, lichens, microbes, evolved to fit the conditions of unexploited forests of all ages, and that's why we still need unexploited forests of all ages. This is the Seeing Red map with updated data from 2022, so this is 2.0. The first one we released was in 2020, I think. Green is primary forest, and red is previously degraded by roads, logging, agriculture, and other things. And it was meant to show the cumulative effects of industrial logging, industrial forestry. Climate change means that we're going to be getting more frequent and extensive natural disturbances in our natural forests like fire and insects. These scientists say that when it comes to facing down climate change, large areas of primary forests are expected to have a higher adaptive capacity and stability compared to forests under human pressure because they're more connected, biodiverse, and have microclimate buffering. So what they mean is that large intact landscapes are better able to withstand climate change because they have more wildlife species, so wildlife need other wildlife to survive. Those species have options to move and shift as temperature and precipitation patterns change in the future. We're already seeing that. And because natural forests do not become as hot and dry in the summer nor as cold in the winter. So where does this leave us? Well, we've really backed ourselves into a corner. But because modern forestry is at best for some species habitat degradation, and at worst for some species permanent habitat loss, we do not agree that what's left should be industrialized. It's too late for different forms of industrial logging primary forests, so the shards of green that you saw on the Seeing Red map. Those are our chances to lifeboat nature, and they have to be left alone. Because there are fundamental trade-offs between industrial forestry and biodiversity, we don't think you can do everything on the same piece of land. So industrial logging and protecting animals and plant habitat is incompatible on the same piece of land. We need to separate incompatible uses and safeguard the adaptive capacity that's present in natural forests. And to that end, we support a system of functional zonation, which was first pitched in the BC government's Old Growth Strategic Review report, which came out, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. If we want healthy biodiversity in a changing climate, we need to allocate land to the maintenance of healthy ecosystems and the species that those ecosystems support. So as I said, the idea of zonation was presented by Gary Merkel and Al Gorley in the Old Growth Strategic Review document that came out in 2020. But the zonation system that they proposed, we thought was bad because the protection zone they suggested would allow for logging. And we're like, what's the point of that? We think primary forest ought to be zoned out of any kind of industrial management, that restoration should focus on degraded areas that can connect primary forest, and that a third zone for forestry ought to be where the management and the extraction takes place. The federal and provincial governments have committed to conserving 30% of the land base by 2030 for the express purpose of stemming biodiversity loss. A system of zonation, as described here, would give your grandchildren a fighting chance for a future with the wildlife that we currently take for granted. So we think that naturalness is more important than age, that primary forests are disproportionately important in a changing climate, and that we should zone primary forests out of the industrial forestry land base. And that's my talk.
So we'll take some time here to do some questions. If you raise your hand, Jennifer will give you the microphone.
Hey, thank you for putting this on, Jennifer. This is great that we have a chance to gather like-minded people. Jennifer and I know each other. I've been putting stuff in forestry reform for quite a few years. My name is Randy Thompson. I'm the Green Party candidate for Prince George, North Caribou. And I work in forestry in that I drove truck for Arrow for 10 years. I know I read about forestry reform. I've seen things from the inside. I also worked for the city of Connolly. One of the things when I worked for Arrow, and we'd have fires, the fires that would take down fir forests, they called it burnt fir. So it was like a free-for-all where you could just like, all of a sudden all those trees become available. So there was like a rush to take all those trees down. And my boss said, you gotta get them within 6 months because a fungus starts to attack them when they're standing. And my thought was, exactly, because the forest knows what it's supposed to do is bring those trees down to the ground so they can become part of the forest soil. The habitat on the forest floor is critically important because that's what forests live in. I guess my question is I'm more concerned about, well, concerned as everything else, but soil seems to be not necessarily ignored, but put to the side. As a farmer, I think that's critically important to highlight that if we keep doing this, like that picture with the strip through the middle of it, that's just gravel. That's not soil. We're losing our soil. So how do we bring that to the attention of the public as well?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I don't think I mentioned how important soil is, but I completely agree, and you're absolutely right. And there are people actually at this institution that discuss how important soils are for storing carbon, for microbes and other life forms. So I didn't mention that, but I completely agree that we need to be talking more about the importance of healthy soils. And that's part of the reason we support primary forest protection, because those soils won't get churned up by machines. We believe you have to just leave them alone to keep accumulating carbon and life and nutrients. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Michelle. That was a beautiful presentation. I agree with everything. I just wanted to say the one point you made about...
Can you hold the microphone closer?
Yeah, the point you made about the, there was all these words, keywords that government uses to just discredit or cast aside these forests. I take it personally. It's so the same concept of how they were able to cast even people away. And I want people to really start to honor life and respect life. And it's such a simple science, but all the science is backing it up nowadays. And my little mini question for you is just about, has the government looked into carbon credits and if it's worth anything, like on a global scale, like is it worth, you know, something, I don't know, monetarily?
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Sabina. I also feel really personally offended when I hear about a naturally disturbed forest being referred to like that. And it just reveals a lack of knowledge, but it also is because it's about PR. And when people want to access these places, the only way they can do that is by making what they want to do seem virtuous. And I think it really helps to diminish the value of these places. Carbon, yeah, there is a carbon offset system, and BC has a protocol for forest carbon. They just came out with a new one. I think, although there's a lot of criticisms about carbon offsets and carbon credits, I think they're actually a useful tool for some communities to earn money outside of extracting. So I do think there's actually an opportunity for that as an alternative to destroying forests. And I'd be happy to talk about that more with you. I was doing a bit of that actually in my paid day job. So I do know a little bit about that world. And thank you very much for the question, Sabina.
Just to see that visual comparison for people to be like, over the long term, how much it's worth as opposed to what they get one cut, not even under 30 years or more.
Okay,
yeah. So I have to go to the language thing, but thank you so much, guys.
Thank you for coming, Sabina.
Sharing both the trees.
Thanks for the question. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention the hydraulics. I think I talked to you about that, about the lakes out my way. They're two lakes that are just about dry thanks to
Use the mic, use the mic.
thanks to logging up on George Mountain. They did over 5 kilometer by 2 kilometer wide. It's the biggest logging I've ever seen. And I mean, you know, I've been in the mountains and stuff. This is huge. And it's affected the 2 lakes fireplaces. They've wrecked the springs going to the lakes and they're going dry. So it's just ridiculous. And they even, the one lake, they turn around and they, what do you call it? They add fish to that lake and now it's half. It's 6 feet lower than normal thanks to logging. So it's just crazy what they think they can do.
Thanks, Leonard.
It's encouraging to see that other countries in the world, I think there are 7 or 8 of them, have banned primary forest logging, including New Zealand and China, because they recognize the international science on this. So hopefully we follow through. My question for you, we've got this 30 by 30 initiative, and it seems that governments are really good at sometimes taking a great idea and screwing it up. So could you tell us a little bit about how 30 by 30 might help your cause and how that might be done well?
Yeah, so if 30 by 30 were to be implemented well here, and there is there's federal money for doing that, and there's also money at the provincial level for, say, First Nations communities to conserve parts of their territories that have high biodiversity value. I think the best way to see this roll out in BC is to scoop up all the primary forests that we have into that percentage, and then also look at where we ought to be restoring to connect intact areas with other intact areas, and do that via restoration, and then have a zonation system for other uses. So we should be looking at the places that are most under threat right now first, but we should also be scooping in at this point in time, we're in an era, I think people have, eminent scientists have described it as an era of biological annihilation. At this point in time, we need to be protecting everything that's natural, even if it doesn't look like it's obviously valuable to our eyes. Because every other part of the landscape now has been degraded, and that is kind of an easy route into having areas that are for industrial extraction, and then other areas that are for nature. Like I said, I think those two things are incompatible. I think forestry has been approaching it as if we can somehow have landscapes where all those things work together somehow, but I think it's failed. So the 30 by 30 is a really good opportunity for us as a society to decide which places we don't want to lose for the long term.
Thanks, Michelle, and for all the work that you've been doing over the years also. My question is a bit simple and maybe from my own ignorance, but forestry is a major industry in the Prince George region. Do you think it can continue to be a major industry in the Prince George region, but just by changing the way it's managed, by making it more local, maybe less mechanized? Is there a way that it can be maintained as a major industry, but still not doing all the devastation that you've enlisted for us?
Thanks for the question. I knew I was going to get a hard one like that involved answering something about economics and jobs. I think that question is probably best aimed at someone who has sort of a better idea from an industrial forestry standpoint, but I don't personally think that the industry is going to look the same after the next few years. So we're going to have to look into it really intensifying industrial forestry in some parts of the landscape, maybe somehow developing an economy around restoring some areas, and probably doing things way differently, maybe even switching industries. So, we're seeing mills closing. That's all happening because the wood is just not there anymore. And one of the concerns, of course, is that we just come up with other ways to exploit natural forests. I think that's our fear, is that we'll just pivot from doing the one thing we're doing right now that is destroying nature to another thing that's going to destroy nature. This morning I did an interview with Global TV about pellets in the pellet industry. And of course, that industry can take much more than, say, the traditional dimensional lumber industry does. So it has the potential to really wipe out a lot of the areas that we haven't annihilated yet, or at least destroyed. And that's a really scary prospect. But I think now's the chance, like as CAMFOR is obviously shutting down and getting ready to leave, now's our opportunity to really decide on the future we want. We'd be pretty foolish to not put a lot of care and attention into thinking about what we actually want for this community, where the jobs are going to be, what we want our natural landscapes to look like. Like, we have to use now as the opportunity to do that and not do some foolish switch into, for example, just going into pellets or something like that. Like, I'm pretty scared about that, so yeah. And I'm sure a lot of other people in this room have other things to say and think about this, so it'd be great to hear from others too, who know stuff. Yeah, thank you.
Just a question on the, and excuse my ignorance, what percentage of BC is public forest, and what percentage is private? If it is private land, can they forest it to the ways they want? Just clear cut, do what they want. So my question, and where it comes from, is I grew up in the Peace Country, and there's a lake that I loved, and it was untouched in many ways for years. But as it gets more and more populated, people have their 100 feet of land and log out their property, which they're entitled to do. But it's really a lack of knowledge about the ecosystem and how people see it. So even if you do the public lands, I don't know what percentage they are, how do we deal with the awareness for the private and the trees and the environment that way? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think about 95% of BC is so-called public or crown land, and the remainder is private. I don't really know what to do to encourage people in private land to keep any primary forests that they have, but I know that because the BC government sees crown lands as their jurisdiction, and of course we have First Nations territories as well. I'm not sure how to deal with private ownership of land. Yeah, it's upsetting a lot of the time, except for education and teaching people about the value to biodiversity and other things of keeping primary forests on their lands if they have private land. But other than that, I'm actually not sure what kind of control we or anyone else has over people's kind of decisions on what they do on their own private lands. But on public lands or crown lands, we do have some influence, and that's why we're talking about it here. Thank you for the question.